Welcome to the Takedown, Subverting Power, Radical Thought. This is again another one of our monthly episodes that we do. Um, of course, last week was the first Monday of the month. Unfortunately, that just so happens to be the first of the year. So that's a holiday. We, had various plans. Many of us were not at home and things of that nature. We're spending time with our families and alike, friends as well. So we decided to take that day and kind of move it to this week. So here we are this week, and we're kind of ready to start up the conversation. I'm your host, Nick Nowlin. I also have Richard here with me today.
Hey everyone, just setting up some shots. Been a while since we had everything lined up, and just wanted to be happy that Nick invited me to join us. I'm really excited about the conversation we're going to have. Also excited with just for those who aren't aware, Anoa from The Way with Anoa was just on BBC Nightly, and so you can check that out there and check out her feed to find a link to relevant information, some other shows, and then also relevant to I think our discussion today. I just wanted to shout out Wendy Muse, who's been working on the Left Pocket project at Left POC. Check that out on Twitter. It's something I've been really engaging with a lot, and I think if this conversation interests you, that you're going to want to follow along with that. But I will hand it back to Nick while I set up some more stuff on the backside.
All right, thank you for that. I did see that clip there, and I think what Anoa had to say there was right on time. Really, it's really important, and I think we should all take a look at that video where she was on having a discussion. I watched it earlier today. I thought it was great, and I would urge any of my followers to do the same. Most of us who are on PA, if you follow PA, follow the shows on PA, you're looking at all that stuff already, and I'm glad and happy that one of our members is really expanding the brand and doing that and bringing that knowledge and really bringing that critique that you just don't get to hear on mainstream news anymore. You just don't get to hear that anymore. But today, one of our topics is one of the biggest topics is going to be political education. I think Richard and I, we've always kind of engaged in a conversation about what goes on, and a lot of times I think that the conversation we have is centered on a problem that we tend to run into on the left, and I think that problem is not everybody is going to be not everybody is going to be at the same place at the same time in terms of their political journey. Like, we have to remember that there was a time before you were as radical as you are today. Your politics kind of grows as you grow. And when you encounter people who are at a different stage in that journey, you have to be mindful of many things. And I think sometimes we come off as being condescending or really, it's really just like a condescension, because you're trying to engage in conversation with somebody and you feel like you're drawing on a wealth of knowledge they just don't have access to. And in many instances, that may be something that's real. You may be drawing on a wealth of knowledge that they don't have access to, and at the same time, nobody wants to be talked down to, right? Nobody wants to be talked down to, but when you're speaking in a field, you do have to realize that if you haven't put in a lot of necessary time to understand some of the things that are going on, it's a very complex world out there. Where do you draw that balance? And I think Richard and I, we were having a conversation about, how do you kind of navigate that? And I'm going to bring Richard in and just kind of let him explain his point.
The conversation we were having on Twitter, I think, was interesting and valuable, and I think part of it has to do with some of the social traits that tend to come with people that excel in academia. I think when you excel in academia, some of the social nuance that gets transferred with people that have to find their successes elsewhere aren't transferred in the same way. And so I think that some of the discussion, the way that you have a discussion and the way that you discuss things in academia as well, are different than the way you would discuss them if you were at a chicken shop or at a local grocery store or wherever. The kinds of conversations that you have are different, and the way that you engage with people are different. And so I think that there's an aspect of that that comes across, like you mentioned, to say people don't like to be talked down to, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of social stuff going on, but I also think that there's practical questions that we have to answer as well, as far as how do you engage with people that just aren't going to engage with you where you're used to engaging, whether that's righteous or not. It's where we are today.
Okay. So I want to draw some distinctions, and I want to first start off by saying, when we're talking about how we treat individuals and how we engage with one another individually, and this is an individual conversation because we're talking about like one-on-one, small scale, right? Not necessarily the collective argument here. I want us to be clear that there are just distinctions between people that can exist in this conversation. So what Richard is talking about when he refers to people who are in academia, I'm going to venture and say that sometimes there's a lot of knowledge there that isn't necessarily applicable or isn't necessarily valuable to the everyday person. However, that doesn't mean that there's no academic knowledge or no historical knowledge or no knowledge that's not, that's applicable to you. And I think like when we're talking about generalizations, we just need you to have a general understanding, some kind of overarching kind of abstract view of kind of where you are, so to speak. Like you might not know all the streets and all the nooks and all the crannies. You might not know all the shortcuts, but you have a general layout of the city. This city has 4 streets, and these are the main roads, and they go, from east to west, north to south, and vice versa, right? Like if you can know those things at a general level, you're ready to engage in conversation, even if you don't know all the side streets. And I think that's what I'm talking about. And I don't mean from an academic standpoint either, because a lot of these thoughts, these ideas that are highly abstract, if you look at it in a general sense, a lot of it is a very apt description of the conditions in which you live. You just have to be able to recognize that this is what you're experiencing. And what I'll point to is, a lot of people feel like, erudition is a real time consuming thing. But I'll tell you, just as Jamu Baraka, who I interviewed, quite some time ago, explained to me, there is no revolution without revolutionary theory. And I think when you read, some of the works of Gramsci, some of his notes, he tried to examine why revolutions fail. And one of his findings was that the people who were in the revolution, the activist square or the social consensus wasn't moved radically enough away from the ruling doctrine such that the ruling doctrine was able to reconfigure itself and survive basically the movement, just outlast the movement, because the minds weren't radical enough to be able to move themselves far enough away from where they were. And so the reason why that happens is because we aren't doing a very good job of what I like to call political education. Like, everybody wants to be an activist. You want to get out in the streets. You want to do something. You want to be somewhere. That's great. That's needed. It's 100% needed. But when it comes to, speaking about ideas, knowing where to be, knowing what you're fighting for and how to get what you're fighting for, that's when you have to have a little bit more. And not everybody has to have that, right? Like half of, how they say half the battle is just showing up, half of life is just showing up. You've already done that part. But now it's like, okay, we've got the people showing up. Now we need to know what those people are to do when they get where they're supposed to be going, what they are to do when they're fighting for things, what they're supposed to be fighting for, how to achieve the goals that they want to achieve. And that's not just left up to, lawyers and things of that nature. It's not just left up to professors. Some of that's going to be by homegrown, autodidactic intellectuals that are grown from within the community. And these people, they need to be well versed in some, broad spectrum revolutionary theory, so they can better understand how to guide the thought process, how to pull people towards that radical edge, how to make sure everybody understands that, hey, look, if somebody comes out with some bullshit, don't just fall for it. Right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think you summarized pretty well how I feel as well. Like it's not very far off from my feelings. I also made a video that kind of addressed that as well. I showed it to Nick before we started rolling, but due to concerns about any sort of copyright stuff, I didn't want to get Ben's channel ding, so I didn't want to run it here, but I did put a link down in the description. Should be, you may have to refresh the page if you were joined us right away. Otherwise, it should be down there. And in the video, I kind of, it's my way of expressing a lot of what Nick just talked about. And I think part of my reasoning for making the video, and the reason what I think it addresses as well, in part, is what Nick was just expressing was pretty concise and to the point, but was still articulated in a way that I think a lot of people will have a hard time relating to. And just because they have a hard time relating to it, I don't think it's not because they don't agree or they don't have similar feelings or thoughts, but more or less because it's just hard to engage with the language being used and the concepts and the quotations and so on and so forth. And so I feel like we need to do more. Like, I think those should be like it. More people should be able to engage at the level that that Nick was discussing the topic at. But then also we need to find ways to engage people who are not prepared for that. And I find that sorely lacking beyond some comedic outlets, which is pretty much the only way that I think has been successful at addressing this issue so far that I've noticed. And successful is questionable. I'm stretching the use of that term.
Let me come in right there, Richard. So key to that is going to be okay. You know, what does that look like? Like how can we achieve those things? And the first thing I want to say is we have to be what I like to call patient. Like, I mean, I like to call it patient, but it's really just patience. Like, we have to have patience on both sides. Number one, the people who have put in the time have to have patience with those who have not moved that far, you know, and it's an exhausting exercise. I'm not going to lie to you. There's nothing worse in the world than trying to hold somebody's hand and lead them through the truth. And you're trying to have to like force feed it to them. There is nothing worse in the world than doing that time and time and time again, like over and over and over again. It's mentally exhausting. But at the same time, you have to remember, like, you know, everybody comes along in their own time. And you know, if you just can stay consistent and, you know, you speak to that person enough and your points make a lot of sense in a lot of different areas and they see the how contiguous your analysis is, like across a broad spectrum of issues, you have more credibility and you'll start to see people kind of move towards you. And this has just been my individual experience. You know, of course, if somebody's just a 180 and they're not ready to listen, they're not open to it, there's nothing you can do. That person is lost. You have to move on. But, you know, a lot of times when people are willing to listen, if you kind of slow roll it, a lot of times over time, they will begin to see that, like, you know what, you know, I don't find a lot of contradiction in what he's talking about. And I think that particularly when we're talking about, you know, the neoliberalism that we have, or like this failed elite liberalism, elite liberalism that we have kind of masquerading as like a left-wing politics that we have today. The problem is, you know, they say a lot of stuff, but all they do is just make contradiction after contradiction between their actions and what they say. And when people see that contradiction, they just turn off. They're like, you're just a hypocrite. I can't listen to you. And this happens on both sides. You know, everybody wants to be like, I'm smarter than you. And people want to believe in their own righteousness. They want to believe in their own exceptionalism, you know, part of our American culture. But nobody wants to see that, like, both sides are being played in similar, very, very similar ways. Like, just like Republicans run game on their people, Democrats run game on their people. And it's easy. It's easy when you believe that the enemy has no redeeming qualities or has no, you know, legitimate points. It's easy to just fall into a trap like that. But back to what I was saying originally, I just want to say that it's going to take patience from both sides. Obviously, if you haven't put in a lot of time in reading and learning about history and basically unlearning a lot of like common sense things that you bring to the conversation that, you know, have just been untrue. Like, there's a lot of common sense stuff that we're taught and brought up with that's just not true. And, as you grow older, you run into these things, and what you do is you compartmentalize it. You say, okay, that thing turned out to be not true, but that doesn't apply. It's not logical that other things that I've learned that could be fundamental to my politics could also not be true. So when you hear somebody speaking something that you've never heard before, you just think it's straight out of left field. But we have to understand that common sense doesn't necessarily work for you. The consensus doesn't necessarily work for you.
I mean, the one that comes to my mind, that leaps to my mind, that I've seen recently kind of scattered along my timeline, is the argument about trying to explain to, particularly in Black communities, why capitalism isn't working for them. And that, excuse me, in the video I mentioned, it's Tupac kind of references it a bit about, basically how Du Bois came up and how that was the way to get over on the man. So, you make the money, come up, get out, and that was the plan. And so I think the idea that the idolatry of money, the worship of, whatever, of whatever earthly things, or however you want to phrase it, but essentially I think that plays a large role in that's the one that comes to my mind, in that unlearning things that we've learned coming up, is that essentially Black capitalism is the way to liberation, is what a lot of people, I think, particularly of our generation, a little older and especially younger, Black capitalism has been taught as the way out.
Yeah, and this just goes back to what I'm talking about.
JC
a lot of common sense,
also in the story of OJ and a variety of things. Go ahead.
Yeah, but a lot of common sense and stuff. That stuff is just not healthy. Like, a lot of it's just a mythos that's perpetuated that's not necessarily true. And like all cultures have them. Like, they have this mythos that like they're great and they're awesome and they're without contradiction, and nothing could be further from the truth. And even the idea that like our problems are naturally occurring things that are unchangeable, that are fixed and they're immutable. Like that's also just not true. Given time, given application, problems can be addressed. That doesn't mean new problems don't arise. There always will be problems, but they do not have to be the exact same problems. They'll be ever changing and ever different. And we can move beyond the problems we have now to inherit new problems in the future, better or worse. So I think we've kind of covered a little bit about political education, so to speak, but like there's so much more that can be spoken on this topic. And I'm going to use some examples. Like, when I talk to people, they have a favorite politician, whether it be Donald Trump, whether it be, John McCain, whoever, Mitt Romney, Barack Obama, they tend to kind of compartmentalize, like they tend to fragment like the record. Like, they don't see like politics as a continuous flow, like a continuum. They see it like as like an instant in time, and then everything else that happened in the past is just gone. And then like you move to the next one in an instance in time again. And it's just like, random dots on a graph that have no correlation to one another. There's no ebb and flow. And I think that interpretation of politics is so limiting, because you kind of misunderstand how you got to where you are. And then because you don't understand how you got to where you are, you don't understand that certain actions that you may be engaged in the instance lead you to where you're going, and where you're going is a worse position than where you are right now. For instance, if I'm going left or north, and then like I get to some place that I don't want to be, I don't know, where, and I say, okay, I'm just going to forget how I got here. I can end up going in about, I can make 3-4 lefts, on a block, right? And I can end up exactly where I was, because I didn't recognize that I've been here before. I didn't recognize that I took the same street that I took from a more southern position. I took that same route north, and now I'm exactly back where I came from. And it's because I didn't keep a history of where I was. So I started making decisions that were each new. They were new decisions at the time, leading me down different streets. But then I got to the point where I was finally back at the same place I was before. But because I didn't remember that, I ended up exactly where I was before. And it's just like, how do you prevent yourself from doing that? You have to keep a history.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the education in the history is critically important, and I think in the video that I'll probably keep referencing, I think it's captured well with Fred Hampton and talking about how the revolution in Haiti and how Papa Doc replaced the white oppressors by, instead of teaching people to hate the oppressors, he taught them to hate the white people. And so he got rid of white oppressors, replaced them with black oppressors. And he also mentions that, we'll get black capitalists and lead us down to black imperialists, which I think is symbolic of where we end up with Obama. And so I think, and we see it again, the Democrats' most recent tweet or something, elect a variety of different type of women. I think Jewish women twice, and that kind of thought process that we've seen of, well, if we put different faces on the same neoliberal corporatist policy, that will end up with better results. And I guess to a moderate degree, there is some aspect of that will, a bit of trickle down in that, in an effort for them, different politicians, to be treated decently within their social circles. Occasionally legislation gets passed that affects them in ways that then makes it so that they can exist in polite company without feeling offended by what's acceptable, but it usually does not trickle down into policy. Most commonly, the most recent example, Golden Globes, Me Too, and the attention that's been paid to sexual harassment in the workplace in Hollywood and a bit in DC. But as far as, your job, your counter job in the service industry or any of that, where various reports put any upwards of 1 in 3 women being harassed, 3 out of 4 actually, I'm sorry, being harassed at the workplace. And so it's pretty absurd. And so I think one of the critical components, as you mentioned, is going to be recognizing when we've been places before, and that, if all things that concern me, I'm actually reasonably confident that some sort of political revolution is nearing. What concerns me the most is that it's going to be co-opted, as we see with something like the resistance, or in that vein. But go ahead.
And I think what it kind of inoculates movements against that is the realization that, we've been here before. We've been on the precipice of change before. Change can be, I'm sorry, there's a saying, right? Justice denied or justice delayed is justice averted or denied. There we go. Justice delayed is justice denied. That saying, it kind of rings true kind of when you're talking about change and political change. Like when you start trying to delay and deny change. When you try to delay change, just because of feasibility arguments and all these sort of weird arguments that don't make any sense when you really think about them. They don't make any sense. Like, we can't do it today because, I don't know, some insert bullshit reason, A, B through C or through Z, They have the effect of just basically denying what we should be doing based on whatever. Insert any reason that you can just, make people believe. It doesn't really have to be real. It just has to exist. But I think right now, there's something we just have to do. And what that has to be is going to be recognizing where we've been before, start reckoning with history, and take some time to educate ourselves. You go to, any of the basically the left-wing revivals or revolutions that happened in the 70s and 80s and 90s in South America. It's not uncommon to bump into somebody that like, when you ask them about Marx, they might barely be able to read and write, but they'll be able to kind of articulate like a general sense of what Marx was talking about. And it's because they grouped together in communities and taught one another, some of his insights. And that's not to say that if you just read Marx, everything is going to be all better. No, that's just, there's certain ideas that people need to have a framework to being able to kind of interpret the world. And I think a good saying is that man is a product of history, not data. Man is a product of history, not nature, is what I meant to say. And when we understand that man is a product of history, that means we have to understand our history to be able to progress. Because think about it. What if every generation we didn't have like a written history and an accumulated technology? So every generation we had to reinvent the wheel. Every generation we had to reinvent the boat, reinvent the gun, reinvent the sword, whatever. How far would humankind advance? We would only be able to advance as far as one generation is alive. You know, every time you have to just restart, right? Obviously, it doesn't work that way. You know, I'm just throwing out a hypothetical, right? But the reason why it doesn't work that way is because we can learn from the experiences of others. And to put on top of that, like there's also these people that be like, that feel like, hey, you can't know about something without experiencing it yourself. And I'm like, no, that's farce. You know, the best person to articulate an experience will be the person who's lived it, right? But the best person to articulate, you know, a category or a common situation faced by plenty of people with similar experiences and categorize that and group them together so we can address them collectively will be somebody who studies and does that work for a living. That's who that's going to be. You know, it's not going to be the person who lives it because they live it from an individual level. It's going to be the person who studies it and understands it from a systemic level, because guess what? You're going to have to address it at a systemic collective level, not the individual level. And those two are two different things. Those skills are two different skills. So, you know, it's not always the oppressed that are best, you know, best to design policies that are going to lift their oppression. They're the best to describe what their oppression is and how it works every day. But then that stuff has to roll up. It has to concatenate. It has to aggregate into a policy that's going to apply to the masses. And that is for somebody who's actually done the work and understanding how these things interact with one another. And it's very complex and it's very complicated. Not saying anybody can't do it, but I'm saying there's a skill that's there. It's a profession. And these people work very, very hard. And I think we need to give them also a seat at the table because their work is really important. Just like the work of the people who show up in the activist space is really important.
I think one of the struggles that we're facing is that there's been a distrust that's been engendered for experts, in that a lot of experts have been misguiding us, lying to us, you know, doing all sorts of misinformation, however you want to categorize it. And I think that's generated a lot of distrust for experts in general. I think when you start to get into specifics about experts within certain fields that we're talking about, I think there's been a little less mistrust engendered, but I think that or distrust engendered, but I think there's also a lot of room for plenty of distrust among the people that we're supposed to, you know, if I were going to ask for an expert in policy for that improves Black lives, somebody might suggest to me Elijah Cummings, because, you know, he's an experienced lawmaker, Black civil rights activist, so on and so forth. But I might contend that he hasn't really had any significant success legislatively for Black Americans in decades, let alone maybe perhaps his entire career. And so, like, identifying who is an expert and what their expertise allows them to do, I think, is important as well. And I think that's going to be critical in building more trust towards the experts that I think you rightfully point to us needing the assistance of if we're going to make the advances that we want to see.
So look, of course, I'm not just saying expertise for expertise sake, right? I'm basically hoping that both sides, you know, either, you know, you have your intellectuals, you have people that are given platforms that speak on things that may not even know. And you also have people that are, you know, in academia that actually, you know, do research and things of that nature. But there's also a level of homegrown intellectuals that also have their place, and I think I make sure that I mention those individuals, right? But so when we're talking about who we're going to listen to, that has to be decided collectively by the community. But if you have enough background knowledge, like foundational, like I said, if you understand, you know, we have, you know, 4 roads and they kind of run a square, north to west, east, you know, north to south, east to west. If you understand those 4 roads, it's a lot harder for you to be bullshitted. You might not know all of the details, but you know the main streets, you know the main highways, so you can kind of travel, and you'll find that the ideas that are consistent with those main streets or main highways will be the ideas that you want to kind of travel along. And ones that are not consistent with that, they tend to kind of fall to the wayside, right?
I just wanted to clarify. I meant John Lewis earlier and not Elijah Cummings. So just to clarify my point. But anyway,
Yeah, and you have to remember some of these people that we're referring to, they're not necessarily experts. You know, being in Congress doesn't mean you're an expert on any particular issue. You just happen to be in Congress, and a lot of those congressmen, they're either a lawyer or they're just some random person that just got elected for whatever reason. That's not really being a policy person. You know, a policy person could be a professor who studied like poverty. It could be sociologist, an anthropologist. It could be a historian. It could be an economist. It could be people who have just read those things.
One might wonder why our
just read those things.
One might wonder why our policymakers aren't experts in a variety of these fields that you mentioned. But continue.
I mean, well, the disparate fields, right? Like they don't all, like, obviously there's no one person who's just going to be an everything person, right? You know, obviously there's people that are going to be better at some things than others. And I think when we start talking about what leadership is, that's where I think the politician really comes into play, because a politician has a unique role in that they can both shape the electorate and they also can shape the landscape in which the electorate operates. So like if you're running for office and you lose, you know, there's things that you can do in losing that set up the stage for the next person beyond you, or another run by even yourself if you're young enough, right, to run again, that you can set the stage for there to be another opening for somebody else to come in. At the same time, you can lose in such a way that it doesn't mean anything, or you can win in such a way that it doesn't mean anything. You won, but you didn't really change the electorate. You didn't really do anything. And by the time you left, you know, it was like you weren't even there. Like you accomplished very, very little because you didn't win in the proper way. So it's like, it's not just about winning and losing. It's about winning properly and losing properly and doing something for a purpose. Now, some people do things for a purpose, and we don't know what each individual person's what their agenda is. And sometimes, you know, it's kind of like a touch feel kind of thing, and you just kind of have to watch people, because obviously, you know, this is about exchange, right? You know, what are you giving? What are you getting? But at a baseline point, there's a way to do politics, you know, from the politician's level, where they're not just helpless and hapless and waiting on the electorate to do something. They kind of shape the electorate. It's a feedback kind of thing. It's fluid.
Yeah, I mean, my current opinion on politicians, I versus how you describe what they can be, I guess might be a little bit different. I currently see politicians mostly as used car salespeople, and that they're trying to sell me neoliberal, conservative, whatever you want to call it, bullshit, billionaire corporatist policy in a way that they think is going to be palatable to me. Democrats think that the best way to do that is tell me that socially I'm acceptable. You know, my black skin is socially acceptable. My sexuality is socially acceptable. My X, Y, or Z is socially acceptable, so long as I adhere to the corporate, you know, indebted slavery that they're working towards, or whatever, however you want to phrase it. And on the right, they go with the hard sell that I should subscribe to the whatever, however you want to describe, like, I guess the exploitative system, capitalistic system that we use in this country. If I subscribe to that, then I won't die from starvation or some other plague or, you know, pestilence. Those are the two sales techniques that the two parties employ in order to sell essentially slightly varying corporate interests policy. And so when we talk about electorates and inspiration and that stuff, I think, sure, there's probably some local politicians and a variety of people that have been inspired most recently that don't really adhere to this point. And I think it's something that happens over time in Washington to even some of the best politicians that have been sent there. But as of now, I don't see our system functioning in such a way other than as acting as a marketing department for billionaire corporatist policy.
Okay, so I think we share a view. I think we share the view there, but that's you know, I think you go one step a little bit further than I'm willing to go. So where you say our system today works in this way, I'll add to. Well, actually, I'll take it a step further. I'll add the part that, but it doesn't have to be that way. It can be changed from that. That's not an unchangeable situation. It's not immutable. It's not necessarily like the natural progression of things. You know, history doesn't stop until we're all gone, till the human race is gone. So if it's like this today, there's not necessarily a guarantee that it must be that way for all eternity, right?
I was just
So-
recently watching the documentaries by J.B. Johnson, Born Rich, and what was the other one? The 1%. And in it, I want to say Robert Reich. He talks about how in the 1900s we chose reform rather than revolution or socialism or anything like that. And I think that's part of the argument that we're having today, or that we need to be having today, is whether is reform possible? Is the system salvageable, or is revolution the only alternative because the system is just too broken, corrupted, never designed to function in the way that we imagine it, or any of the above?
Okay, so I want to take a second. There's a comment in the comment section that I've been watching the chat here, and some of this stuff is like, okay, but then, there's some gems in here, and like I think, man, I just lost the actual comment. It just moved here. Holy crap. Okay, yes, it was about late night show comedians. And like I know I've made this point before. Some people feel that they're important and they do an important function. I would say like certain comedians do. I think George Carlin did a great job with his comedy.
Just to have Carlin back. There's so many people I would give to have Carlin back. But go ahead.
But I think in many ways, when you're talking about like John Oliver or even Stephen Colbert, like these people, they're not really out there as like a real social critic. What they're doing is they're taking the mainstream establishment news and they're basically cutting it up, and then they put some comedy in between, and then they feed it to you. And because they're putting comedy in between, it's easier for you to somebody who can't watch the news, somebody who doesn't like the news because it's boring or it's not entertaining. They mix entertainment in with the same propaganda and they feed it to you just like you do a little kid. You mix their medicine in with the applesauce and they eat it. That's all they're doing. They're just taking the propaganda, cutting it up in like small, easily digestible chunks, and they're just feeding it to you. So like, I just don't think that they do a very good job as far as educating the populace. And what I'll even say on top of that is I think at a certain point, why do we need to be entertained all the time? Sometimes politics is a very serious deal. Sometimes that stuff is very, very serious and we need to be serious about it. Sometimes it's not going to be fun. It's going to be work, but that's what democracy requires. And I think when you're talking about living in a democratic society, like it's not about fun all the time. There's an actual burden that has to be carried by each individual member. And I think our reluctance to pay that burden and get in there and do that has been to our detriment. Other people say that John Oliver, does a very good job of educating you on a variety of diverse topics. I would say I utterly disagree. I've watched John Oliver for well over a year and change. And when I watch this show, it's just like watching the mainstream news. It's very, very uninformative. Like, it's just uninformative, period. And I can start bringing up, some moments where I thought he was pretty funny, like where he was, talking about Carlo Danger. Does anybody remember Carlo Danger? And he brought back that Danger song. He started doing his little dance or whatever. I thought that was hilarious. But would I call it informative? No.
I mean, I think that there's some things that he did a reasonably decent job with, but I mean, I wouldn't, as far as being informative, I wouldn't put it very high. But I would say, as far as engaging people who would not traditionally engage with that information, with some information, like for instance, when he talked about prisons, and like I think the way that he mentioned, is like 1 out of 12 inmates are raped in prison, and is like, we find that acceptable and we'll make jokes about it. But if 1 out of 12 of your, morning pastries got raped, people would be, there'd be morning news specials on it every day until it stopped happening. Right. And so like the fact that we take our donut, like somebody putting their dick in a donut at our morning office more seriously than we take it for inmates happening systemically and serially all across the country, I think people wouldn't engage with that information if he didn't present it in that way. But I don't think that alone is going to be enough. When people get interested, when that piques their interest, there has to be somebody there to pick them up and take them the next step.
Yeah. So You know, I see a lot of comments here in the chat section, and they're always talking about simplicity. Here's the
Sorry if that was
problem.
graphic, by the way. Apologize.
Okay, I was going to say people are always talking about simplicity. The problem is a lot of this stuff isn't simple. Whenever you have somebody that's explaining stuff really, really simply, and you have somebody else kind of stammering, trying to provide detail and context and stuff, and it's getting complicated, you know, one person is lying to you. They're lying through omission. And that's because the world isn't simple. Trying to make it simple starts to kind of border on mistruth. You know, you start coming away with things that aren't necessarily true because you're making it too simple. You know, and I hate to be that way. You know, you have to just boil it down to something simple. Well, I'll be honest with you, the world isn't simple. And if I boil it down to something simple, it just amounts to a lie. I'm just lying to you. So I think that going back to the point about the continuum, and I kind of want that to be a recurring theme throughout the show today. And I want to take this time to ask everybody who weren't with us, who was not with us in the beginning of the show, to check out Richard's video. There's a link there. But I just want you guys to take some time and actually look at that video. It kind of goes along with what we're saying. It's going to be like excerpts of great people talking about important parts of what we're talking about today when we talk about political education. But I kind of want to make a point about a continuum. You know, if you don't know where you came from, you know, it's hard to keep yourself from kind of going in a loop. And I every time I look in politics, I just see, you know, a lot of times we're just kind of going in a loop. It's like, didn't we already try this before? Why is this strategy still going? This has already been tried. This has already been done before. You know, there's a certain things that just kind of pull in front of us, and we go to it like it's something new. And then, boom, you get there and you go back in the loop again, and you're back in the same spot. And then they give you the same things like it's something new, and you go back in the loop again. It's like, come on, please start keeping a history. Do some kind of historical reference so you can know, okay, well, I've been here before. Yeah, I've done something like that before that didn't work out in the past. They did something like that before. It didn't work out in the past. So we can start making better decisions. And because we don't do that, it's like, again, everything is just like in an instant without looking at it like a continuum. But here's what I want to point to you. To me, the epitome of people not being able to see politics as the continuum is their incessant belief that the marginal differences between Democrats and Republicans in the instant are meaningful enough to make that same binary choice when that same binary choice has been done time and time again, and it's never led us anywhere good. Never. It's always been continually getting worse. And I want to say the reason why we can look at Democrats and Republicans in the instant and say, hey, I can see that this person is better than this person in this instant, and do that. And then next thing you know, we do that for, you know, a certain amount of time, and then we still end up with what we were trying to avert in the first place, was because we're not remembering the decisions we were making of the past. We're looking at everything in an instant. We're not looking at the continuum again. And I'm going to keep saying it. I've said it like 6, 7, 8 times, 10 times. But if there's nothing else that you get from this show today, it's that politics, history, it's a continuum. Everything does not exist in a unique instance, so to speak. It flows. And sometimes, you know, we'll go in a loop and we'll do very similar things. Of course, you know, the bells and whistles will change, but the framework will remain very, very constant. And the argument I'm going to make is, do you honestly believe there's no correlation with Obama's failures and Trump's victory? That's a real honest question. And it's going to really challenge how consistent and how logical you are to really answer that question fairly. Because think about it. If more people have been positively impacted by Obama in meaningful, undeniable ways, how likely was it that Donald Trump would be, you know, the victor in a contest that Barack Obama chose to be his successor? That should tell you something. You know, there are failures that the Democrats have that lead to Republican victories. Democrats tend to fail in areas where they shouldn't fail, and that leads to Republican victories, either by demoralization of their own base or by empowerment of their political enemies, by taking their political enemies' stance It's a very weird thing, rather than standing on principle on things where they should stand on principle. I mean, you had something to say, Richard?
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit historical, but the video reminds me of it. Fred Hampton, the DA Hammerhand or Hammerin that was involved in his assassination, working with the CIA and local police department, was a Democrat, and black people basically decided to vote Republican in order to prevent the Democrats from, because even though the party didn't back him, he still won the Democratic nomination in Chicago, and for district attorney or attorney for the attorney in Chicago, and they ended up voting Republican in order to make sure that he didn't win. And so you mentioned looking at history and seeing the places that we are and coming back. It was a failure of Democrats in Chicago then to stand up and actually make anybody suffer any consequences for that and show any real attrition for it. And so we can see it happening again and again in the future, still happening in Chicago, specifically Baltimore, across the country, a variety of places where Democrats have taken power, Obama being one of the prime examples. One of the things I wanted to mention before we wrap up was just regarding the education. One of the themes that's not captured in the video, but I think is captured by a lot of those people in the video in other speeches that they give and other talks that they have given, is that we cannot expect that this political education is going to come from the public education system. I mean, I myself have expressed positive ideas towards civics, and I think that there is a role to play in the civics classroom and in the public education space. But if we're going to get what we need to get happening, it's going to mean engaging, and it's going to mean engaging with people outside of that, in their communities, at their local hangouts. And in order to do that, we're going to have a variety of ways to do that. It's not going to be just handing them a pile of books. It's going to be engaging them in revolution music. It's going to be engaging them in a variety of different types of media and arguments and discussions, and using a variety of techniques. One of the things that I think is going to be critical is something like a Khan Academy for revolutionary radical thought, whatever leftist thought, however you want to categorize it, but a resource that anybody can use, and that is laid out in a way where there's a natural or sensible progression, so that you can capture information and you can specify in particular fields if that's more important, organizing, or if you want to learn more about organizing, if you want to learn more about theory, or if you want to learn more about these things. I'm not going to expect people to end up at colleges getting PhDs while also supporting their family and all these other things from less than savory or generally acceptable practices, or whatever people are doing to get by. And so going to have to meet people where they're at. And I think that's going to be one of the ways that we're going to be able to do it. But I'll pass it off to Nick so we can pretty much wrap us up.
Okay, well, before we wrap up, there's one topic of conversation I kind of want to get into, but we might not have enough time to really flesh it fully out. So I'm going to save that. I think what we'll do is I'll go ahead and I think we'll wrap this episode up, but Richard and I will record the conversation that we're going to go into right after this, and we'll put it up on a channel as a separate video. I think we'll be able to do that, and we'll have it up as soon as we can. And that'll be it for that. But what I want to also say, I want to respond to one of the comments here. It says the masses want simple, and that a simple lie is easily repeatable and people will buy them. Well, there's at a certain point where reality just asserts itself. If you speak to reality, that's not saying you have to give every little detail. But if you speak to reality in a general sense, you speak to reality and you calibrate it fairly accurately, generally enough, regardless of how often they buy the lie. If you keep putting that reality out there, the more often the lies fall, because there's only so many times you can tell the same old types of lies. They kind of pile together. They'll look and they'll say, hey, you know what? He's been saying this. Let's just try that. None of these other things have worked for us. Let's just try that. And if you don't think it works like that, look at the Republican Party. Look at it. They just say ridiculous things. And when Democrats get in there and they're garbage, guess what happens? They get their turn. That's just what happens, because people say, well, let's just give that a try. It doesn't matter if it sounds reasonable or not. It could be the most crazy thing. As long as it's not exactly what you are in, and it speaks to something that you're really feeling at the moment, you will go for it every time. You can say the masses want simple. That ain't it. It's not they want simple. They just want something other than what they're in right now, and that's not being offered. So, I think sometimes we have to step outside of ourselves, and especially when you start, using terms like the masses. It's a weird thing to really do. Like, these masses are just people. It's just like you, and by having a nuanced opinion doesn't necessarily make you better. It just means that you put a little bit more time into something that they may or may not have done so. Like, I think we have to resist the urge to feel better than someone else because we just put more time into something than someone else. I think that's wrong in its own.
We have to be very, very careful not to make presumptions about why somebody hasn't engaged with the material in the way that you or whoever else may have. That don't presume to know why, and just try to recognize where they are and try and figure out how you get them from where they are to where we want them to be, rather than try to focus on the negative aspects of their lesser person because they weren't able to identify these things as quickly or when you were able to.
Now, I want to leave us off with 2 quotes today because we're kind of running out of time. I want to thank everybody for watching the show tonight. Sorry if we're a little all over the place, but again, we're just getting back into the swing of things, so just kind of bear with us on that. But I want to say 2 things. The first quote is going to be, people will believe anything because they want it to be true or because they fear it could be true. If you read fiction, you'll know where that comes from. And then the real quote, from actual revolutionary thought, I try to do at least 1 or 2 of those kind of every episode or 2. And that is, those who expect to reap the blessings of freedom must, like men, undergo the fatigue of supporting it. Keep those 2 quotes in mind, people. Have a good night. Oh, and don't forget, we have another show tonight. We have another show for the extended conversation, something that's really, really important. We'll be talking about Coast versus West, and we'll be talking exclusively about that for another 20 minutes or so.
Yep, check it out on the Nick's channel, and we'll also have the video that's down in the description over there as part of the video for this conversation. So thank you all for joining us.